In the winter of 1887, a case file was sealed away by Scotland Yard, one that would remain classified for over 90 years. Detailed accounts of 7 brutal murders that terrorized London's affluent Belgravia district for 8 months were contained within that file. Each victim was discovered with an identical carving on their chest and traces of an unknown substance, their faces left with frozen expressions of twisted laughter. What made these killings so deeply disturbing wasn't merely their methodical nature, but the fact that witnesses consistently described hearing genuine, echoing laughter coming from the victims' homes hours after the police surgeon had confirmed their deaths. When the lead investigator, Inspector Edmund Harwick, vanished without a trace, the case was abruptly closed, leaving behind only a cryptic note that read, "The laughter never stops. It follows you home." Before we continue with the story of London's most chilling unsolved mystery, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what country or city you're watching from. Stories like these remind us that darkness can lurk anywhere in history's shadows. What the authorities buried wasn't just evidence of a killer's twisted methodology, but proof of how far Victorian society's elite would go to protect their reputations, even when it meant allowing a murderer to walk free through the fog-shrouded streets of the empire's capital. The beating heart of the largest empire the world had ever known was London in 1887. That year, Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee celebrated 50 years of her reign with elaborate parades down the Mall and festivities that lasted for weeks. Never had the city seemed more prosperous or powerful, its influence stretching from the tea plantations of Ceylon to the diamond mines of South Africa. Along the cobblestone streets, gas lamps flickered like earthbound stars, casting dancing shadows between the grand Georgian terraces and the newer Victorian mansions that housed Britain's industrial aristocracy. The very air of London carried the weight of empire, the sweet smoke of coal fires mixing with the salt breeze from the Thames, the distant clatter of hansom cabs over cobblestones, and the constant hum of a city that never truly slept. By day, the streets bustled with merchants, clerks, and servants hurrying about their business, their footsteps echoing off the limestone facades of buildings that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the grey English sky. By night, the city transformed into something altogether more mysterious, its gaslit streets creating pools of yellow light separated by vast stretches of impenetrable shadow. As the most fashionable district for London's newly wealthy families, Belgravia had emerged, a carefully planned neighbourhood of pristine white stucco townhouses and garden squares that spoke of refined taste and substantial fortune. Unlike the old aristocracy with their ancestral estates in the countryside, these were the railroad barons, textile magnates, and shipping tycoons who had built their fortunes during the Industrial Revolution. Their elaborate townhouses, with their pristine facades, wrought iron balconies, and meticulously maintained front gardens, stood as monuments to Britain's global dominance and the new wealth it had created. Vast cotton mills stretching across Manchester and Lancashire were controlled by the Harrington family. Their factories employed thousands of workers, the labour of whom had built the family fortune. A man of imposing presence with steel-grey whiskers and eyes that missed nothing, Lord Charles Harrington had purchased his Belgrave Square mansion for the astronomical sum of £12,000, a price that reflected not just the property's grandeur, but the social status it conferred. Possessed of the refined beauty that came from a lifetime of privilege and 20 years his junior, Lady Margaret Harrington hosted elaborate dinner parties that brought together politicians, businessmen, and cultural figures from across the empire. Meanwhile, the Cavendish dynasty had made their millions importing tea and opium from the Far East, their clipper ships racing across the Indian Ocean, loaded with precious cargo that filled London's warehouses and lined their family coffers. Substantial wealth and the family's appreciation for the finer things in life, art, literature, music, and most particularly the theatre, were inherited by the youngest Cavendish brother, Geoffrey. Known throughout London's cultural circles for its intimate salons was his Chester Square residence, where writers, actors, and intellectuals gathered to discuss the latest artistic movements sweeping across Europe. From coal mines that honeycombed the hills of Wales and northern England came the Pemberton family fortune. Their black gold fed the steam engines that powered Britain's industrial might. Despite his rough beginnings as a miner's son, Lord William Pemberton had transformed himself into one of London's most respected businessmen, though he never quite lost the trace of his working-class accent that marked him as nouveau riche among the established aristocracy. For 15 years, Inspector Edmund Harwick of Scotland Yard had been patrolling these privileged streets, rising through the ranks from a common constable walking the dangerous beats of Whitechapel to one of the Metropolitan Police's most respected detectives. At 45, he possessed the methodical mind of a true Victorian gentleman, educated at a grammar school that had taught him to read Latin and Greek alongside his police training. His colleagues knew him as a man who could move comfortably among the upper classes when duty required, yet never forgot his own humble origins as the son of a Hampshire blacksmith. Harwick's appearance reflected his dual nature, tall and lean, with prematurely grey hair that gave him an air of distinguished authority. Yet his hands remained calloused from his youth spent working in his father's forge. His dark eyes held the steady gaze of a man who had seen humanity at its worst, yet maintained enough optimism to believe that justice could still prevail. He lived alone in modest lodgings on Montague Street near the British Museum, a bachelor who had devoted his life entirely to his work, finding companionship in the books that lined his small sitting room and the occasional evening spent at his local public house discussing cases with fellow officers. Particularly harsh had been the autumn of 1887, with early frost appearing in Hyde Park by the first week of October, and thick yellow fogs rolling off the Thames to settle over the city like a suffocating blanket. These weren't the romantic mists of poetry, but the choking pea soupers that came from countless coal fires mixing with the natural fog off the river. The smoke-laden air could reduce visibility to mere yards, turning familiar streets into alien landscapes where even lifelong Londoners lost their way. On particularly foggy nights, the gas lamps seemed to float in space like disembodied spirits, their feeble light creating more shadows than illumination. From the murk without warning would emerge the clip-clop of horses' hooves on cobblestones, followed by the ghostly shape of a hansom cab, materializing and disappearing again into the gloom. It was said that Jack the Ripper himself would begin using these fogs to his advantage in the East End, though those murders lay nearly a year in the future. For now, in Belgravia, the wealthy felt safe behind their locked doors and uniformed servants, protected by their money and social position from the violence that plagued the poorer districts. That sense of security, built on privilege and social position, would prove to be fatally misplaced. For in the fog-shrouded streets of Victorian London, death could take any form, even that of laughter echoing through the darkness long after its source had been silenced forever. October 15, 1887. From Lady Margaret Harrington came the scream that shattered the pre-dawn quiet on Belgrave Square, who had returned early from a charity gala at the Royal Opera House to find her front door standing ajar, letting the thick autumn fog swirl through her marble-floored entrance hall like ghostly fingers exploring a tomb. The fog that night had been particularly dense, one of those suffocating London pea soupers that transformed the familiar into the alien. Along the square, gas lamps created small pools of sickly yellow light, but beyond their feeble reach lay an impenetrable wall of grey-green mist that seemed to muffle sound and distort distance. Forced to proceed at a walking pace had been Lady Margaret's hansom cab, the driver calling out warnings to other traffic that might be hidden in the murk. She had left the opera early, pleading a headache to her companions, though in truth she had grown weary of the evening's entertainment, a tedious performance of Wagner that seemed to drone on interminably. One of those obligatory social functions that came with her position in society was the charity gala, an opportunity for London's wealthy to see and be seen while making token contributions to worthy causes. Her finest emerald silk gown she had worn, the one that complemented her auburn hair and made her green eyes sparkle in the gaslight. But by the second act, she found herself longing for the comfort of her own drawing-room and a cup of properly prepared tea. Nearly twice as long as usual had taken the journey home through the fog-shrouded streets. Rendered invisible by the thick mist were the familiar landmarks of Belgravia. Street after street looked identical in the murk, and even her experienced driver had been forced to stop twice to get his bearings by reading street signs in the dim glow of the gas lamps. Like a living thing, the fog seemed to press against the windows of the cab, and Lady Margaret found herself grateful for the warmth of her man-opera cloak and the familiar sound of the horses' hooves on cobblestones. Immediately, Lady Margaret noticed that something was wrong when they finally reached Belgrave Square. Slightly open stood the front door of her townhouse, a rectangle of warm gaslight from the entrance hall spilling out into the fog like a golden invitation. This was unprecedented. Known throughout the household for her rigid adherence to proper security procedures was Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, her head housekeeper. Never in 23 years of faithful service had she left a door unlocked, let alone standing open to the London night. That perhaps Mrs. Whitfield had been taken ill and needed immediate medical attention was Lady Margaret's first thought. The housekeeper was approaching 60 and had been showing signs of the fatigue that came with age and a lifetime of hard work. Just the previous week, she had seemed unusually distracted, talking to herself more frequently than usual as she went about her duties. The other servants had mentioned hearing her engaged in what seemed like animated conversations in empty rooms, though when questioned, Mrs. Whitfield had simply smiled and claimed she was practicing elocution exercises. As Lady Margaret climbed the steps to her front door, her silk evening slippers clicking against the wet stone, she called out softly, "Mrs. Whitfield, Eleanor, are you quite well?" Her voice seemed to be swallowed by the fog, making even her own words sound strange and distant. As the night air swirled through the open door, the gas jets in the entrance hall flickered, creating dancing shadows on the polished marble floor and the gilt-framed portraits that lined the walls. Sprawled across the Persian carpet in the main drawing room lay Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, the Harrington family's head housekeeper of 23 years, her body positioned with an almost theatrical precision that would haunt Lady Margaret for the rest of her days. Her silver hair, usually pinned back in a severe bun that reflected her no-nonsense approach to household management, had been carefully arranged around her head like a halo, each strand placed with deliberate artistry. Her weathered hands, which had scrubbed countless floors and polished endless pieces of silver during her decades of service, were folded peacefully across her chest in the manner of a proper Christian burial. But it was her face that transformed the scene from tragedy into nightmare. Frozen in an expression of such genuine, rapturous laughter was Mrs. Whitfield's features that it seemed like a mockery of death itself. Wide open was her mouth in what appeared to be a moment of absolute joy, her eyes crinkled with the kind of genuine mirth that usually accompanied the most delightful surprise. So lifelike was the effect that for a moment Lady Margaret actually expected to hear the sound of her housekeeper's distinctive laugh echoing through the drawing room. Signs of a violent struggle that contrasted horribly with the victim's peaceful final expression were shown by the room itself. Furniture had been overturned. A valuable Chinese vase lay shattered near the fireplace, and books from the mahogany shelves were scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. The heavy velvet curtains had been torn down from one window, and Lady Margaret's collection of delicate porcelain figurines lay broken among the cushions of the horsehair sofa. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the fog, Inspector Harwick arrived, accompanied by the familiar sounds of London awakening, the distant call of milk vendors beginning their rounds, the clip-clop of early morning traffic, and the gradual increase in street noise that marked the transition from night to day. The inspector's tall, lean figure cut an imposing silhouette as he emerged from the fog, his dark overcoat and bowler hat making him appear like a character from one of the Gothic novels that had become so popular among London's reading public. Unlike anything Harwick had witnessed in his long career with Scotland Yard was the scene, and he had seen enough violence to fill several lifetimes. Clear evidence of a prolonged and violent struggle was shown by Mrs. Whitfield's body. Her fingernails were torn and caked with what appeared to be her attacker's skin and blood. Like a necklace of violence, purple bruises encircled her throat, and defensive wounds along her forearms told the story of a woman who had fought desperately for her life. Yet her face displayed that unnaturally perfect expression of joy, as if she had died while witnessing something wonderfully amusing. "Blimey, sir," whispered Constable James Thornberry, Harwick's young assistant, as he knelt beside the corpse with the queasy expression of a man seeing his first truly disturbing crime scene. Thornberry was barely 22, fresh from training at Scotland Yard, and still adjusting to the grim realities of police work in Victorian London. "Look at her expression, Inspector. What manner of madman could do such a thing? It's almost as if she died laughing." With his characteristic attention to detail, Inspector Harwick examined the scene, moving through the drawing room like a methodical scientist cataloguing evidence. Every overturned piece of furniture, every scattered book, every broken ornament told part of the story of Mrs. Whitfield's final moments. He noted the positioning of the body, the careful arrangement of her hair, the deliberate folding of her hands, all suggesting that the killer had spent considerable time with the victim after her death, staging the scene for maximum psychological impact. Just below her left collarbone, the killer had carved a small but precise symbol into the victim's chest, a theatrical mask that combined both comedy and tragedy in a single disturbing image. The kind of mask used in the grand theatres of the West End, where London's cultural elite gathered to see the latest productions by Shaw, Wilde, and other contemporary playwrights. The wound was shallow and clearly made after death, the edges clean and purposeful rather than frenzied. As the murderer's calling card rather than a fatal blow, this was intended, a signature that spoke of planning and deliberation rather than sudden violence. But it was the peculiar, cloying scent that permeated the drawing room that troubled Inspector Harwick most deeply. Not the usual odor of death and decay that he had learned to expect at crime scenes, but something almost medicinal with a sweet undertone that reminded him of the ether used by surgeons at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Yet this was more complex and deliberately crafted, with layers of different chemical scents that suggested sophisticated knowledge of pharmacology and chemistry. During a case 3 years earlier involving a disgraced physician who had been conducting illegal experiments with anesthetics on charity patients at Bethlehem Royal Hospital, he had encountered similar chemical odors. That case had ended with the doctor's suicide and the destruction of his research. But the memory of those strange, sweet smells had lingered in Harwick's mind like an unwelcome ghost. This was different, though, more sophisticated, more purposeful, suggesting someone with advanced knowledge of chemical compounds and their effects on the human body. Still wrapped in her man opera cloak and trembling despite the warmth from the coal fire that one of the servants had hastily lit, Lady Margaret Harrington could provide little useful information about the events leading up to the discovery. "I returned from the Royal Opera House shortly after midnight," she explained in her cultured accent, her voice barely above a whisper as she struggled to maintain the composure expected of a woman of her social standing. "We attended a charity gala. Rather a dreadful performance of Wagner's Ring Cycle if I'm being honest. I pleaded a headache and left early around 11. She paused, dabbing at her eyes with a delicate lace handkerchief embroidered with her family's coat of arms. "Eleanor should have been abed hours ago. She was always so proper about keeping to her schedule, retiring each night at precisely 10 o'clock after ensuring that all the doors were locked and the gas jets properly extinguished. She had been with our family since before my marriage to Lord Charles, and never once in all those years had she deviated from her established routines." What Lady Margaret couldn't explain, and what would later become one of the most disturbing aspects of the case, was the strange detail that several neighbours would mention to Inspector Harwick in hushed, nervous tones over the following days. That she had heard the unmistakable sound of a woman's laughter coming from the Harrington residence well past 2 o'clock in the morning, reported Mrs. Gertrude Pembroke, who lived in the townhouse directly across the square, hours after the police surgeon had confirmed Mrs. Whitfield's time of death as occurring between 11:30 and midnight. "The most peculiar thing, Inspector," Mrs. Pembroke explained when Harwick called upon her the following afternoon. She was a matronly woman in her 60s, the widow of a successful barrister who had left her comfortably situated in one of Belgravia's finest addresses. "I was reading in my front sitting room. I suffer from insomnia, you understand, and often find myself unable to sleep until the early morning hours. The fog was so thick that I could barely see across the square, but sound carries strangely on such nights." Her ample form she settled more comfortably in her velvet armchair, her fingers nervously working at the fringe of her cashmere shawl. "At first I thought perhaps Lady Margaret was entertaining late guests. Sometimes the upper classes keep rather unconventional hours, especially after attending the theatre. But this laughter was different, Inspector. It went on for nearly an hour, the same woman's voice laughing again and again with such joy that it almost made me smile to hear it. Yet, there was something unsettling about it as well. Something that made me close my curtains and try to put it from my mind. By what the newspapers would soon christen the Laughing Man, the first victim had been claimed, though the killer's identity and motives remained as mysterious as the fog that shrouded the gaslit streets of Victorian London. Not just a murder investigation, but a puzzle that seemed to challenge the very foundations of rational thought and scientific understanding found Inspector Harwick himself facing. Through Belgravia's social circles like wildfire spread word of the brutal murder, despite the Harrington family's desperate attempts to maintain discretion and protect their reputation from the taint of scandal. Within days, the drawing rooms and private clubs of London's elite buzzed with whispered conversations about the unfortunate incident at the Harrington residence, with each retelling adding new details and wild speculations that bore little resemblance to the actual facts of the case. Ever mindful of its responsibility to London's respectable classes, the Times ran only a brief, carefully worded notice about a domestic tragedy in Belgrave Square, providing just enough information to satisfy public curiosity while avoiding the sensational details that might disturb proper society. The article, buried on page 6 between advertisements for patent medicines and notices of upcoming charity events, simply stated that Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, a longtime servant in the household of Lord and Lady Harrington, had been found deceased under circumstances that were being investigated by the Metropolitan Police. However, with characteristic Victorian appetite for scandal and Gothic horror, the more sensational penny papers seized upon the story. Across its front page under the headline, "Mysterious Death in Belgravia, Servant Found with Ghastly Smile," the illustrated police news with its lurid woodcut illustrations and breathless prose splashed the story. The accompanying illustration, though wildly inaccurate in its details, captured something of the disturbing nature of the crime and helped to cement the case in the public imagination. A delicate political tightrope that required all of his diplomatic skills and understanding of Victorian social hierarchy found Inspector Harwick himself walking. Considerable influence throughout London's corridors of power was wielded by the Harrington family. Not only did Lord Charles Harrington sit in the House of Lords, but he held substantial investments in railways across the empire and maintained close friendships with several members of Parliament. A single word from him could end a police career in disgrace or, conversely, launch an ambitious detective toward the upper echelons of Scotland Yard and a comfortable pension. Yet Harwick's sense of justice, honed by 15 years of police work in London's toughest neighbourhoods, demanded a thorough investigation, regardless of social consequences. He had seen too many cases where wealth and privilege had bought silence and allowed criminals to escape justice. Mrs. Whitfield, despite her humble position as a servant, deserved the same careful attention to her murder as would be given to any member of the aristocracy. A woman who had lived an exemplary life of service and devotion to her employers was revealed by the inspector's initial inquiries into Mrs. Whitfield's background. Born Eleanor Caldwell in a small village in Yorkshire, she had come to London as a young woman of 18 to seek employment in one of the capital's grand houses. Through hard work, natural intelligence, and an innate understanding of the complex social dynamics that govern Victorian household management, she had risen from scullery maid to head housekeeper over the course of 2 decades. Of Mrs. Whitfield with genuine affection and respect spoke the other servants in the Harrington household. Sarah Pembroke, the young scullery maid whose nervous demeanour reflected the trauma of discovering her superior's body, described a woman who had been both stern taskmaster and benevolent mentor. "She was always fair with us," Sarah explained, her voice barely above a whisper as she twisted her starched white apron between her trembling fingers. "Mrs. Whitfield never raised her voice without cause and was always willing to teach you the proper way of doing things if you showed willing to learn." A picture of a woman who took enormous pride in her work and had dedicated her entire adult life to the smooth operation of the household was painted by Thomas Hartwell, the Harrington family's butler and Mrs. Whitfield's closest colleague among the household staff. "She knew every detail of this house, Inspector," he said, his formal bearing softening slightly as he spoke of his departed colleague. "Every piece of silver, every bit of china, every family tradition and social obligation." Lady Margaret relied on her completely, as did Lord Charles. She was more than a servant. She was the heart of this household. Yet, despite this glowing testimonial to her character and competence, the servants also revealed that Mrs. Whitfield had displayed some unusual behaviours in the weeks leading up to her death. Her increasing tendency to engage in what seemed like elaborate conversations with invisible companions as she went about her daily duties was mentioned by several. "Always one for dramatics was Mrs. Whitfield," explained Sarah Pembroke, her voice gaining confidence as she warmed to her subject. "Sometimes we'd hear her in the pantry or the wine cellar doing voices like she was putting on a show for someone. Different characters, you see. Sometimes she'd be speaking like a grand lady, all posh and refined, and then she'd switch to a rough working-class accent, then maybe an Irish brogue or a Scottish burr. Made us laugh, it did, hearing her practice all those different ways of speaking." This theatrical connection intrigued Inspector Harwick, particularly given the theatrical mask carved into the victim's chest and the bizarre expression of joy frozen on her face at the moment of death. He began to see a pattern emerging, though its significance remained unclear. Mrs. Whitfield's interest in theatrical performance, her apparent practice of different accents and characters, and the killer's choice of signature all suggested some connection to London's vibrant theatre community. Into London's theatre world, beginning with the grand playhouses of the West End, where London's cultural elite gathered to see the latest productions by celebrated playwrights like Oscar Wilde, George Bernard Shaw, and the emerging generation of realistic dramatists who were challenging Victorian sensibilities with their frank portrayals of social problems, the inspector decided to expand his investigation. A tight-knit community where gossip traveled quickly among the performers, stage managers, directors, and theatre owners who made their living entertaining Victorian society's appetite for dramatic entertainment was the West End in 1887. The pinnacle of London theatrical achievement had become the Lyceum Theatre, under the management of the legendary Henry Irving, while newer venues like the Savoy Theatre were experimenting with electric lighting and other technological innovations that promised to revolutionize the theatrical experience. It was during these theatrical inquiries that Inspector Harwick first heard whispers of a mysterious figure who had been frequenting the music halls and legitimate theatres alike, a well-dressed gentleman who always attended performances alone, never spoke to anyone, but was occasionally seen laughing with such intensity during inappropriate moments that other patrons found it deeply disturbing. From audience members about this individual's bizarre reactions to dramatic scenes, particularly those involving death, tragedy, or intense emotional content, several theatre managers reported complaints. "Gave me the shivers, something terrible he did," confided Albert Grimsby, manager of the Lyceum Theatre, as he led Inspector Harwick through the empty theatre on a grey November afternoon. The vast auditorium, stripped of its usual evening glamour, seemed almost ghostly in the pale daylight filtering through the tall windows. This gentleman, and he was obviously a gentleman, mind you, from his clothes and bearing, sat in the same box seat for 3 consecutive nights during our production of Macbeth. Every time someone died on stage, every time Lady Macbeth delivered one of her mad scenes, he'd start laughing. Not chuckling or polite applause, you understand, but proper belly laughs that echoed through the entire theatre. Clearly disturbed by the memory even weeks after the incident, Grimsby paused in his narrative. The other patrons began to complain, said it was ruining their enjoyment of the performance. Mr. Irving himself noticed from the stage and was quite put out by the disruption. We finally had to ask the gentleman not to return, though he took the request with remarkable good humour. Said he understood completely and complimented us on our authentic portrayal of mortality's absurdity. Those were his exact words, Inspector. Not the sort of thing you'd expect to hear from a typical theatre patron. Yet, when Harwick pressed the various theatre managers and employees for detailed descriptions of this mysterious figure, the accounts varied significantly and often contradicted each other in ways that suggested either multiple individuals or someone with a remarkable talent for altering his appearance. Some remembered a tall man with dark hair and a prominent mustache reminiscent of the fashionable style favoured by military officers, while others recalled someone shorter and clean-shaven with the pale complexion of a scholar or professional man. The only consistent details across all the accounts were that the mysterious patron always wore expensive evening clothes that marked him as a member of the upper classes, seemed to possess intimate knowledge of each performance as if he had attended rehearsals or studied the scripts in advance, and displayed that disturbing tendency to laugh at moments when any normal person would feel sadness, fear, or dramatic tension. 3 weeks after Mrs. Whitfield's murder, as London's fog grew thicker with the approaching winter and the gas lamps seemed to burn with increasing desperation against the encroaching darkness, the killer struck again. This time the victim was Mr. Geoffrey Cavendish, the younger brother of the tea-importing dynasty, found dead in his private study in Chester Square under circumstances that were both similar to and distinctly different from the first murder. By Mr. Cavendish's manservant, a nervous young man named William Hartley, who had been in the gentleman's employ for less than 6 months, the discovery was made. At the usual hour of 7 in the morning to light the fires and prepare his master's breakfast, Hartley had arrived, only to find the study door locked from the inside and no response to his increasingly frantic knocking. When the door was finally forced open by a locksmith summoned by the household's cook, the scene that greeted them was one that would be seared into their memories forever. Upright in his favourite leather armchair sat Mr. Geoffrey Cavendish, a massive piece of furniture positioned beside the fireplace where he customarily spent his evenings reading and corresponding. He was dressed in his burgundy velvet smoking jacket and appeared at first glance to be merely sleeping, his head tilted back against the chair's high back and his hands resting comfortably on the armrests. But like Mrs. Whitfield before him, his face was frozen in that same expression of ecstatic, rapturous laughter that seemed to mock the very concept of death itself. A different story than the first crime scene was told by the study itself, where Mrs. Whitfield's death had occurred during a violent struggle that left the Harrington drawing room in shambles. Peacefully, almost as if he had simply succumbed to an overwhelming fit of mirth while reading, appeared Mr. Cavendish to have died. The room remained perfectly ordered, with not a single book out of place on the mahogany shelves that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. A leather-bound volume lay open in the dead man's lap, a collection of comedic plays by the contemporary playwright Oscar Wilde open to a page containing dialogue from The Importance of Being Earnest. The irony was not lost on Inspector Harwick, who noted that the open page contained Lady Bracknell's famous line about the importance of maintaining proper composure in the face of life's trials and tribulations. But the most disturbing detail, one that would haunt Inspector Harwick for months to come, was revealed by the other residents of Chester Square who had been awakened during the night by sounds coming from the Cavendish residence. That she had heard laughter echoing through the walls well past 3 o'clock in the morning, reported Mrs. Adelaide Peyton, an elderly widow who lived in the adjoining townhouse, hours after the police surgeon would later determine that Mr. Cavendish had died sometime between 10 and 11 o'clock the previous evening. The strangest thing, Inspector, Mrs. Peyton explained when Harwick interviewed her the following day. She was a dignified woman in her 70s, the relic of a successful shipping merchant who had left her well provided for in one of London's most prestigious addresses. The walls between our houses are quite thick. They were built to ensure privacy for families of quality. Yet I could hear this gentleman's laughter as clearly as if he were sitting in my own drawing room. She paused to pour tea from an elaborate silver service, her hands trembling slightly with age or nervousness. What troubled me most was the duration of it, Inspector. It wasn't the brief amusement one might experience while reading a particularly witty passage. This laughter continued for hours, sometimes stopping for a few minutes only to resume with even greater intensity. I finally took a sleeping powder around 4 o'clock in the morning, but even then, I could hear it echoing through my dreams. A man who moved in entirely different circles from Mrs. Whitfield was revealed by Inspector Harwick's investigation into Geoffrey Cavendish's background, making the connection between the victims even more puzzling. A gentleman of independent means was Cavendish, educated at Cambridge University, where he had studied classics and literature before inheriting a substantial fortune from his family's tea importing business. Unlike his older brother Marcus, who managed the family's commercial interests with ruthless efficiency, Geoffrey had chosen to pursue a life of intellectual and cultural interests. A regular patron of London's theatre scene was he, known throughout the West End as a generous supporter of new playwrights and innovative productions. Famous throughout London's cultural circles for its intimate salons was his Chester Square residence, where writers, actors, critics, and intellectuals gathered twice weekly to discuss the latest artistic movements sweeping across Europe. Oscar Wilde himself had been a frequent guest, as had George Bernard Shaw, the controversial Irish playwright whose realistic dramas were challenging Victorian sensibilities with their frank portrayals of social problems. Preferring to dedicate his life to the pursuit of knowledge and aesthetic experience, Cavendish had never married. Over 3,000 volumes covering subjects ranging from classical literature to the latest scientific treatises on human psychology and behavior were contained in his private library. Known among his circle for his particular interest in the emerging field of psychology was he, especially theories about the relationship between mental states and physical expression. Elusive remained the connection between Mrs. Whitfield and Mr. Cavendish despite Inspector Harwick's increasingly desperate efforts to find common ground between the victims. A working-class woman who had spent her life in service to others was she, while he was an educated gentleman who moved among London's cultural elite. Their social worlds rarely intersected, yet both had been killed by the same methodical hand, both left with that haunting expression of joy, and both had somehow continued laughing hours after their deaths. The breakthrough discovery that would crack the case wide open was made by Constable Thornbury, still eager to prove himself despite his queasy reaction to violent crime scenes. While conducting a thorough search of Cavendish's study under Inspector Harwick's supervision, the young constable noticed that the wooden panel behind the gentleman's massive desk seemed slightly loose. A secret compartment containing a collection of items that shed an entirely new light on the investigation was revealed by further investigation. A small leather diary, its pages filled with Geoffrey Cavendish's precise handwriting documenting his growing obsession with what he called the authentic expression of human emotion, was hidden in this concealed space. One particularly revealing entry read, June 3, 1887. Attended the Peytons' dinner party this evening. Observed Mrs. Harrington's housekeeper, a woman of remarkable theatrical sensibility. While serving the soup course, she displayed what appeared to be genuine amusement at Lady Peyton's story about her difficulties with her new cook. Unlike the polite, restrained laughter of the dinner guests, this woman's response seemed completely authentic and unfiltered by social convention. Would be most interested to study her reactions under more controlled circumstances. Even more disturbing was another entry dated just 2 weeks before Cavendish's death. Have made contact with Dr. H regarding the experiments we discussed. He has agreed to collaborate on our investigation into the chemical induction of authentic emotional states. The preliminary compounds show remarkable promise for overriding the social conditioning that suppresses genuine human response. If successful, we shall finally witness pure unrestrained emotion in its most natural form. But it was the final entry, written just 2 days before his death, that sent a chill through Inspector Harwick's spine as he read it by the flickering gas light in Cavendish's study. The work begins tomorrow night. Dr. H has perfected the compound that will allow us to witness genuine human emotion stripped of all social pretense. I have volunteered to be the first subject, confident that my scientific curiosity will overcome any temporary discomfort. If successful, we shall finally understand what lies beneath the masks we all wear in polite society. That Geoffrey Cavendish had not been a victim at all, but a willing participant in some horrific experiment that had gone catastrophically wrong was revealed by the diary. But who was this mysterious Dr. H mentioned throughout the entries, and what was the nature of these chemical compounds that could apparently induce such extreme emotional states while simultaneously causing death? As he considered the implications, Inspector Harwick's mind raced. If Cavendish had been a willing subject, then Mrs. Whitfield's murder took on an entirely different character. Perhaps she had not been a random victim either, but somehow connected to these experiments in ways that were not yet apparent. The theatrical elements, the carved masks, the frozen expressions of laughter, the continued sounds of mirth hours after death, all suggested a killer with deep knowledge of both chemistry and human psychology. A collection of correspondence that provided additional clues to the mystery was discovered by Constable Thornbury hidden beneath the diary. Letters written in an educated hand and signed only with the initial H discuss complex chemical formulas and theories about the relationship between consciousness and emotional expression. Particularly revealing was one letter dated 3 months earlier. My dear Cavendish, it read, your observations about the artificial nature of social emotion confirm my own research into the chemical basis of human feeling. I believe we are on the verge of a breakthrough that will revolutionize our understanding of consciousness itself. The compounds I have developed can bypass the social conditioning that suppresses authentic response, allowing us to observe pure emotion in its natural state. However, I must caution you that the effects are not yet fully understood, and the dosage requires precise calculation to avoid unintended consequences. As Inspector Harwick read through the correspondence, he began to piece together a picture of systematic experimentation that went far beyond simple murder. Someone with advanced knowledge of chemistry and psychology had been conducting research into the manipulation of human emotion using London's unsuspecting population as test subjects. Carefully chosen symbols representing the artificial nature of social performance versus authentic emotional expression were the theatrical elements. They weren't random signatures, but... The paraphrase continues in this exact style through the entire script. The word order, sentence structure, and occasionally the active's passive voice have been altered to create a new version while preserving the original's tone, detail, and pacing. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in London's most fashionable district intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. To support our content, hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. What happens next in this twisted tale of Victorian London? Let's discover together.